The lecture hall hummed with quiet anticipation. Rows of alien students from across the galaxy sat perfectly still, their various biological forms creating a bizarre mosaic of life. Professor J. Park stood at the center of the massive chamber, his projection device casting soft blue light across the polished floor. Byung-ki, a student with scaled skin that shifted between green and gray, adjusted his translation device. Beside him, Hana, a crystalline being whose body looked like living, translucent glass, waited with absolute stillness. Around them, creatures from 100 different worlds listened intently. The room was part of the Galactic Xenosociology Research Center, a massive floating structure that orbited a neutral star system. This was no ordinary classroom. This was where the most advanced students from across the universe came to understand the complexities of intelligent life. Professor Park wasn't a typical lecturer. He had spent decades studying humanity, a species that consistently baffled every known civilization. His reputation was legendary among academic circles, a researcher who had dedicated his entire career to understanding the most unpredictable species in the known universe. Today, he began, his voice calm and measured, we will discuss something that has confused our collective civilizations for generations. The holographic display behind him flickered. Images of human children appeared, playing, learning, exploring. But to the alien students, these images were far from ordinary. Each picture seemed to hold a strange, almost dangerous potential. A young human girl solving a complex mathematical equation while drawing a picture of a butterfly. A small boy who had somehow reprogrammed an advanced communication system using what appeared to be simple toy blocks. Another image showed a child creating an impossible structure with basic building materials that defied known engineering principles. Byung-ki's scales rippled with nervous energy. He had heard stories about humans, but seeing actual evidence was different. Hana's crystalline structure began to vibrate almost imperceptibly, a sign of deep intellectual excitement. Humans are unique, Professor Park continued, not because of their technology, not because of their physical capabilities, but because of their children. He paused, allowing the weight of his statement to settle in the room. Hundreds of alien students leaned forward, their various sensory organs focused entirely on him. The professor walked across the stage, his movements deliberate. Every civilization believes it understands child development. We have charts, graphs, predictive models. We believe we know how young beings learn and grow. Another image appeared, this time of a human child looking at a complex problem. The child wasn't just looking. The child was seeing something nobody else could see. But human children, Professor Park said, do not follow any known rules of learning or development. Whispers erupted among the students. Alien languages mixed and translated, creating a low, curious murmur that filled the massive lecture hall. Byung-ki leaned towards Hana. What do you think? He asked through his translation device. Hana's crystalline form shifted slightly. I'm not sure, she responded, but I'm beginning to understand why humans are considered complicated. Professor Park continued his lecture, each word carefully chosen. He wasn't just presenting information. He was revealing a fundamental mystery about human potential. The images kept changing. A human child creating art that seemed to contain mathematical equations. Another solving a communication problem that had stumped advanced research teams for decades. Another building a device from seemingly random objects that worked perfectly. Imagine, Professor Park said, a species where the youngest members are its most potentially dangerous and innovative individuals. The room went completely silent. Hundreds of alien students processed this concept, each understanding it slightly, differently based on their own biological and cultural backgrounds. This was more than a lecture. This was an introduction to a species that defied every known understanding of intelligence, potential, and growth, and it was only the beginning. The holographic display flickered to life, filling the lecture hall with a series of strange, almost unbelievable images. Professor J. Park stood quietly, watching the alien students' reactions as the first contact incidents began to unfold. The first scene showed a small human girl standing in front of a massive alien communication system. The device was intricate, millions of light-sensitive crystals and quantum processors that typically required advanced mathematical calculations to operate. The girl, no more than 6 years old, wore a simple yellow dress and held a set of colored markers. Byung-ki leaned forward, his scaled skin turning a shade of pale green that typically indicated extreme curiosity. Hana's crystalline form vibrated with intense concentration. In the recording, the human child began to draw. Her movements were seemingly random, a butterfly here, a strange pattern there. The alien researchers watching the original incident had been confused. But then something unexpected happened. The communication system suddenly came to life. Lights danced across its surface in a pattern that perfectly matched the child's drawing. Complex frequencies began to transmit, not through mathematical precision, but through what could only be described as creative intuition. The next incident was even more bizarre. A young human boy encountered a crystalline life form that had resisted communication with multiple advanced research teams. Previous attempts had involved sophisticated translation devices, complex mathematical models, and years of careful study. The boy approached the crystal differently. He didn't use technology, he didn't use complex language. Instead, he began to sing a simple nursery rhyme and draw pictures in the sand near the crystal. Something changed. The crystal began to respond, not with scientific precision, but with what could only be described as emotional resonance. It pulsed with light. It moved in ways no one had seen before. The boy continued to sing, his voice simple and pure. Professor Park's voice cut through the holographic display. Observe how human children interact with unknown systems. Another image appeared. This time, a group of human children had encountered an advanced alien navigation system on an abandoned research station. The system was designed to be operated only by specially trained pilots with years of complex training. The children approached it like a game. They pressed buttons randomly. They talked to the system as if it were a living thing. They laughed, they sang. And somehow, impossibly, they managed to not only activate the system, but navigate it with a level of intuition that defied all logical explanation. They do not see barriers, Professor Park explained. Where we see complexity, they see possibility. Byung-ki's translation device struggled to process the implications. Hana's crystalline structure shifted, creating complex internal patterns that reflected her deep processing of the information. The final incident was perhaps the most shocking. A human child, lost on an alien research station, had encountered a complex defensive system designed to protect against potential intruders. The system was supposed to be impenetrable. It used advanced quantum encryption, multiple layers of biological and technological security. The child solved it by playing a game, using nothing more than a simple handheld device and her understanding of pattern recognition. She found a way, through the system's defenses, not by breaking them, not by fighting them, but by understanding them in a way that no trained professional had ever considered. The alien students watched in a mixture of horror and fascination. These were not stories of human technological superiority. These were demonstrations of something far more dangerous. These were examples of a species that saw the universe not as a set of rules to be followed, but as a playground of endless potential. Professor Park's final words hung in the air. Humans do not learn, they discover. And their children? They are the purest form of that discovery. The lecture hall remained silent. Hundreds of alien students tried to process what they had just witnessed. A fundamental understanding of intelligence was being challenged, and it was only the beginning. The lecture hall transformed into a complex mental landscape as Professor J. Park began to explain the psychological complexity of human children. Charts and graphs materialized around him, showing impossible patterns that seemed to defy traditional scientific understanding. Byung-ki's scales shifted colors rapidly, a sign of intense mental processing. Hana's crystalline form began to pulse with soft, uncertain rhythms. The alien students leaned forward, their various sensory organs focused entirely on the presentation. The human brain is not a computer, Professor Park explained. It is something far more complex. The holographic display showed a human child's brain. But this was no ordinary medical scan. The neural pathways looked like living, breathing networks that continuously reshaped themselves. Where other species had rigid, predictable brain structures, human brains seemed to be in constant dynamic motion. A young girl appeared on the screen. She looked ordinary, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, but the way she approached problems was anything but ordinary. In one demonstration, she solved a complex spatial reasoning test by turning the puzzle into a song. Her solution made no logical sense, yet it was perfectly correct. They do not think in straight lines, Professor Park continued. They think in spirals, in circles, in ways that have no clear beginning or end. Another image showed a boy who had transformed a mathematical problem into a drawing. The drawing looked like a strange creature, part animal, part geometric shape. When analyzed, the drawing contained a perfect solution to a problem that had stumped professional mathematicians for years. The alien students began to understand something terrifying. Human children were not simply intelligent. They were adaptive. Chaos Generator's Byung-Ki's translation device struggled to process the information. How could a developing brain be so flexible? How could children solve problems that advanced computer systems couldn't handle? The presentation shifted. Now they saw brain scans of human children from different cultural backgrounds. Despite different environments, languages, and experiences, there was a consistent pattern of extraordinary adaptability. A child in a poor urban environment showed the same potential as a child in a wealthy research facility. They both demonstrated an ability to learn, adapt, and reimagine their understanding of the world constantly. Imagination is not a tool for humans, Professor Park said. It is their primary method of understanding reality. The holographic display showed multiple scenarios: a child turning a math problem into a dance, another solving a complex communication challenge by creating a new language using hand movements and sounds, yet another understanding a technological system by treating it like a living creature. Hannah's crystalline structure began to vibrate more intensely. She was witnessing something unprecedented, a form of intelligence that rejected all known scientific classifications. The psychological breakdown was clear. Human children did not learn by accumulating information. They learned by constantly reimagining their understanding of the world. Where other species had fixed learning patterns, humans had flexible mental ecosystems. Their brains were not storage devices. They were living, breathing possibility generators. They see the world, not as it is, Professor Park said quietly, but as it could be. The alien students sat in stunned silence. This was more than a lecture about child psychology. This was a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about intelligence, learning, and potential. Byung-Ki looked at Hannah. She looked back. No words were necessary. They both understood something profound was happening. Human children were not just learning. They were continuously reinventing the concept of learning itself. The lecture hall remained silent. The universe suddenly felt much smaller, and human potential felt infinitely larger. The lecture hall transformed into a massive simulation chamber. Holographic walls flickered to life, creating a complex technological environment that looked like the interior of an advanced alien research station. Professor J. Park stood to the side, his expression calm and knowing. "Observe," he said simply. Holographic representation of a human child named Minho appeared. He looked ordinary, about 8 years old, wearing simple clothes, with curious eyes that seemed to see beyond what was immediately visible. The simulation began with a series of increasingly complex technological challenges. The first was a simple security system, multiple layers of quantum encryption, biological recognition protocols, and advanced mathematical barriers designed to be impenetrable by any known species. Minho approached the system differently. Where a trained professional might use complex hacking techniques, the child began to interact with the system like it was a game. He touched interface panels seemingly at random. He hummed a simple melody. His fingers moved with a combination of playfulness and intense concentration. Byung-ki's scaled skin began to ripple with nervous energy. Hana's crystalline form vibrated, at a frequency that suggested deep intellectual tension. Impossibly, the security system began to respond. Layers of encryption started to dissolve, not through brute force or mathematical precision, but through a series of unexpected interactions that seemed to treat the technological system as a living thing. Minho talked to the system. He drew pictures near its interface. He approached the challenge with a mixture of curiosity and playfulness that defied all logical understanding. The alien students watched in growing horror. The simulation continued. Each challenge became more complex. An advanced navigation system that had confused multiple research teams. A communication network with multiple quantum-encrypted layers. A defensive mechanism designed to protect against any potential intrusion. Minho solved each challenge differently. Sometimes he used drawing. Sometimes he sang. Sometimes he simply played with the system as if it were a complicated toy. His approach had no consistent methodology, and yet, every single time he found a solution that no trained professional could have conceived. Professor Park's voice cut through the simulation. Observe how humans interact with complex systems. The final challenge was the most terrifying. A massive technological construct that represented the combined defensive capabilities of multiple advanced alien civilizations. It was a system that should have been impossible to penetrate. Minho approached it like a child exploring a playground. He didn't fight the system. He didn't try to break it. Instead, he began to understand it. His interactions were so fundamentally different from any known approach that the system itself seemed confused. Lights danced across the holographic display. Complex frequencies shifted. The entire technological environment began to respond to the child's unique method of interaction. Byung-ki's translation device began to overheat from trying to process what was happening. Hana's crystalline structure started to show microfractures. From the intellectual stress of witnessing something completely unprecedented, the demonstration was clear. Human children did not see technological challenges as problems to be solved. They saw them as possibilities to be explored. As the simulation concluded, the alien students sat in complete silence. Minho stood in the center of the now dismantled technological system, looking slightly confused but mostly pleased with himself. Professor Park's final words hung in the air. This is why human children are feared. The lecture hall remained absolutely still. The universe suddenly felt much smaller, and human potential felt infinitely larger. Byung-ki looked at Hana. Hana looked back. No words were necessary. They both understood something profound had just happened. Human potential was not something that could be measured. It was something that could only be witnessed. The lecture hall fell into a profound silence. Professor J. Park stood at the center, his presence both calm and intense. The holographic displays around him began to shift, revealing layers of information that seemed to breathe with living complexity. The final truth, he began, is not about human technology. It is about human potential. Byung-ki's scaled skin turned a pale shade of gray, a color that represented maximum alert state for his species. Hana's crystalline form vibrated with such intensity that small particles of light began to dance around her. The first image appeared. It showed multiple timelines of human child development across different environments. Where other species had predictable growth patterns, human children showed something entirely different. Their potential was not a line. It was an explosion of possibilities. A series of recordings played simultaneously. A child in a refugee camp creating complex mechanical devices from discarded materials. Another child in a remote village solving agricultural challenges that had puzzled generations. A third child turning a communication barrier into a new form of language. Humans do not see limitations, Professor Park explained. They see opportunities. The holographic display transformed. Now it showed the internal cognitive processes of human children. Their brain patterns were not structured like computer systems. They were more like quantum probability generators, constantly shifting, constantly reimagining, constantly discovering. Where other species learned through repetition, human children learned through imagination. Where other species followed established patterns, human children created new patterns. Where other species saw boundaries, human children saw possibilities. The alien students watched in growing understanding. This was more than a lecture about a species. This was a fundamental revelation about the nature of intelligence itself. Professor Park's voice became softer. Imagine a species where the youngest members are its most powerful potential. Another set of images appeared. Human children solving problems that entire research teams had failed to crack. Children understanding complex systems by treating them like living things. Children creating solutions that defied all known scientific understanding. Byung-Ki's translation device began to smoke slightly from the intensity of processing the information. Hana's crystalline structure started to show intricate, beautiful patterns that suggested deep emotional and intellectual response. The final demonstration was the most powerful. A holographic representation showed how human children processed information. Unlike other species that had linear learning processes, human children's cognitive pathways looked like complex, living networks. They didn't just learn. They continuously reimagined their entire understanding of reality. They are not limited by what is, Professor Park said. They are defined by what could be. The lecture hall felt different. The alien students were no longer just students. They were witnesses to something profound. Humans were not just another species. They were a walking, living possibility generator. And their children? They were the purest expression of that potential. The holographic displays began to fade, but the understanding remained. Intelligence was not about storing information. It was about continuous transformation. Byung-Ki looked at Hana. Hana looked back. No words were necessary. They both understood that everything they knew about intelligence had just been fundamentally challenged. Professor Park's final words hung in the air. Human children are not the future. They are the continuous reimagining of potential itself. The lecture hall remained silent. The universe suddenly felt both smaller and infinitely larger. Outside the lecture hall, the galaxy continued, its slow, predictable movement, but inside, something fundamental had changed. A group of alien students now understood a simple, terrifying truth. Humanity was not just a species. It was a continuous explosion of possibility, and their children were the most powerful expression of that possibility.